tonight's conversation, just so that we are clear, is actually, let me situate it within what Project Humanities calls talking, listening, and connecting. Those of you who have been with us several times, and as you sign in, please tell us where you're joining us from. And if in fact this is your first program with Project Humanities. We know that we have some followers out there, and we've been very grateful that we have taken advantage of the virtual options for national and international participation, but we also like the local folks as well. You also know that we situate these conversations within the context of diversity, but also justice. And we see and believe and know that at the heart of any and all conversations and actions around justice must be these principles: compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. And we invite you to consider the program within the context, and then not just consider the program, but take the pledge. And you'll see the tiny url.com/human101 pledge, and we'll also post that in the chat so that you have an opportunity to do it. But keep that in mind as we move through this conversation of talking, listening, connecting. Now for the content. I want to first introduce the idea. I want people to know that this is not a conversation that is in direct response to the decision that just came down less than a week ago. We had planned this program long before, which shows that Project Humanities really does try to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening. But there was a way in which we had planned this program in anticipation of a decision that would come down one way or the other. And we were so fortunate to be able to have among our team members an intern Olivia Oldham, who says, but my sister Grace has been working on a podcast that's specifically getting at the heart of this decision that will be coming down. So just so that people know that this is not a response to Friday, but it is a context that leads up to, and a prelude, if you will. And Grace will talk also about the fact that there is a podcast in response to. So let me introduce the people who will be facilitating this conversation tonight. Olivia Oldham is our Project Humanities intern. Olivia is also an employee at the Phoenix Art Museum and is an artist. She graduated just in the spring from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a minor in studio art. Her next goal is to work in and study art therapy. She is actively involved in our homeless outreach and has been with Project Humanities for the last year. And I will say that Olivia is also a former student. So she survived the Lester African American Literature class. So thank you, Olivia, for bringing your whole family into this. This feels like a whole full circle moment now, because we know also that your parents, Shannon and Tony, are also part of our homeless outreach team and have volunteered with us more than once. And so to bring your sister tonight feels very special. That Project Humanities is indeed intergenerational, but it's also a family affair. So let's thank you, Olivia, for bringing this idea, and your sister. And I want to introduce your sister, who has a name. Grace Oldham is a Reveal 2001-22 Roy W. Howard Fellow. Grace, who goes by pronouns she and her, earned both her master's and bachelor's degrees from Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. While she was at ASU, she contributed to a documentary on youth suicide in Arizona, reported on local humanitarian aid efforts in the US-Mexico border, and worked on a team of reporters to produce an award-winning story on a botched sex trafficking investigation by federal Homeland Security agents. At Reveal, her focus has been reporting on reproductive justice and gender issues. So who better to lead this conversation tonight? So for those who are here, we just want to acknowledge that this is a conversation about abortion. So we want people to regulate your comfort. It is an adult conversation, so we want you to regulate your own comfort level because it will be a frank and honest discussion. Feel free to talk about, the chat, what you got from the podcast, but also I'll turn it over now to Olivia and Grace to lead us through the conversation. Thank you both for agreeing to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Grace, for being here. As you said, can you tell us more about yourself and how you got into reproductive rights reporting? Were you aware of how pertinent it would be?
Yeah, so Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to take part in this event. As Dr. Lester mentioned, my whole family has been involved in Project Humanities before, so now it's my turn. I'm quite excited for the opportunity. So I studied journalism in school and reported at the Arizona Republic throughout the time I was in journalism school at Arizona State University, and started at Reveal last summer. And so when I started at Reveal, at that point, the Supreme Court had already announced it would hear the decision in Dobbs. And so that was kind of a big signal that, you know, one of the most legitimate threats to Roe v. Wade since it was passed. And as a young woman, and Olivia and I are from Texas, you know, I had interest in covering reproductive rights and abortion access. And so I was put on that beat, knowing that, you know, the Supreme Court would hear Dobbs. And as more restrictive legislation was passing across the country, Reveal, my newsroom, made a really strong commitment to covering issues and topics related to reproductive justice, and, you know, putting effort toward making sure it was forward-looking, investigative coverage. And so we started researching and doing reporting on a range of different issues, everything from, you know, kind of like an alt science community generating research to support anti-abortion legislation, to crisis pregnancy centers, which has led to much of the reporting and research that our newsroom has put out in the last, you know, few months. And in terms of if I had a sense of how kind of pertinent it would be now, I think from early on, we at the newsroom and personally knew that this would be an issue that was going to be really important over the past year and going forward. But still, you know, I think it was months of reporting and research before it really hit me, like how realistic it would be that Roe could be overturned, and, you know, all of the issues that might come from that.
Right. It's a lot to wrap our heads around. So the first reproductive rights podcast you worked on Reveal this year is called A Strike at the Heart of Roe. I'd love to play a clip of the podcast, but first, can you tell us a bit about how the podcast came to be?
Sure. Yeah. So, like I said, our newsroom had made this commitment to doing reproductive rights coverage as one of our main areas of focus in the past year. And we knew it would be newsroom wide. We have reporters that are focused on doing digital articles, data reporters, as well as our radio team, but that also to do the depth and kind of breadth of reporting that we had imagined, that we would have some partnerships as well with other newsrooms, as well as other kind of research organizations. And so this podcast, A Strike at the Heart of Roe, really came out of a collaboration that we had with the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. It was a team of law and journalism students researching. The basis was researching this alt medical community that was generating research to support anti-abortion legislation, as well as like publishing research in journals, and kind of unpacking that community and those networks there. And so we were sort of studying a few different issues, such as you know, the idea that a heartbeat can be detected at 6 weeks. Is it a heartbeat? The concept of viability, sort of moving the viability standard from, you know, 20-something, 21, 22 weeks to 6 weeks, and how that was working. And so that was the basis of the research for this podcast. And in that podcast, we broke down some of the legal theories and the research that really played a key role in supporting the passage of SB 8, so-called heartbeat bill, and is used in, you know, supporting other heartbeat bills across the country, as well as sort of the real impact of, you know, that legislation. And so looking at, at the end of that hour of radio, one of our reporters went to Kansas to an abortion clinic there where people from Texas were having to travel to get abortions, and kind of all of the hurdles that existed, even for people that were able to make it all the way to Kansas. And so, yeah, that was kind of the background of that podcast.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and play a clip of that.
Really surprising that no one agrees. But I'm standing next to Ashley when I overhear that one of the patients being prepped is from Southeast Texas. So did I see that the woman that was sitting here, she was from Texas?
Yes. So she actually came in on Friday, a little bit later in the day, and based on her gestational age, we were unable to see her that same day.
Gestational age just means how far along someone is in their pregnancy. This patient is 16 weeks, early in her second trimester.
We've seen some higher gestations because people are waiting, have to wait 3 weeks, a month to get an appointment.
The higher gestational age means this patient now needs a different kind of surgical procedure. And while the procedure itself only takes 10 to 15 minutes, it's going to take a lot longer to prep her body.
Weekend, so we were able to get her a hotel. And so she came in and she'll get her abortion today. So then she'll go back to Texas.
I don't know this patient's story, but I do know that anyone from Texas sitting in this clinic has had to navigate both Texas and Kansas abortion laws. That means an ultrasound, a counseling session, a mandatory 24-hour waiting period, a second appointment with the same doctor, potentially another ultrasound, 4 to 13 hours of travel, another ultrasound, another counseling session, another 6 to 8 hours of waiting, and up to $2,400, sometimes more, just for the procedure. And that's for someone who is able to get an abortion here. A lot of people won't. The staff at Trust Women.
So in this clip, we heard the hurdles that one woman had in order to get an abortion out of state. What other challenges do you see that could come up with matters such as following the laws in 2 different states?
Right. Yeah. I mean, at that point, there were kind of all kinds of barriers for people traveling from Texas, and it depended on, what state people were traveling to. Early on, a lot of people were also going to Oklahoma, and then, of course, Oklahoma passed some more restrictive legislation, and then that was no longer an option. So, first, coordinating travel logistics and funding for that is a barrier for many people, especially people living in South Texas or near the border. And then navigating the various restrictions in place in whatever state that you may be traveling to, such as mandating waiting periods. And some people, will have to have a consultation, and then you wait 24 hours or 48 hours before the actual procedure can be done, if it's a surgical abortion, or different limitations into, administering pills for a medication abortion. So, that was kind of an early look at what it would be like trying to navigate all of these laws and barriers. And of course now with Roe gone, it's going to be sort of an even more ever-changing landscape of barriers for people. And in many, many cases, I feel like it's important to note that, especially in already marginalized communities, many of those barriers and challenges can be prohibitively difficult. So yeah, there's all kinds of things that could impact a person's access, especially when travel is involved. And many anti-abortion organizations are going to be pushing now to prohibit or put some restrictions on travel as well. So it's an ever-changing landscape.
Sure. And that question can also be opened up into the chat if y'all can think of any other challenges or hurdles, as well as ways that we can aid those who are facing such challenges. Grace, what did you learn from reporting that was interesting or surprising with this story?
Yeah, I think that, with some of this early reporting, so this podcast that we're talking about now came out in February, and the reporting and research that went into it really started in August. And I think that's something that was really striking to me as somebody who wasn't as familiar with this topic before starting the research and reporting in August, was just kind of how complex and systematic all of the work being done by the anti-abortion movement to kind of work toward this moment that we're in now, and just how many facets that there was to that, from kind of building this sort of alt science network that I've mentioned a few times, to produce research, supporting legislation, or to build networks of scientists and doctors that are willing to testify in courts or in state legislatures in favor of legislation. We learned about, for example, there's an organization called the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is the research arm of a more policy-focused anti-abortion organization called the Susan B. Anthony SBA list, Susan B. Anthony list. And their core focus is connecting and forming a network of so-called pro-life doctors and researchers that get published in journals and testify in front of state legislatures. So to know that there's like even just a whole organization for that, and all of the work being done to kind of push for just getting more support around this issue. In the podcast, we talked about a person named Janet Porter, who for more than a decade before SB 8 was passed had been pushing heartbeat bills across the country, and had gone so far as to even make a music video about the heartbeat bills, and kind of win this idea of like winning people's hearts by sort of like pandering to like more of an emotional issue. And it was interesting, again, just looking at sort of how deep that went. We were doing extensive kind of company and organization research into some of the organizations involved. And for example, there was one called the American Pregnancy Association, which on its face is sort of a consumer-facing website with pregnancy information that, at one point was cited by a lot of major sort of like respected medical communities, but it turned out was owned and operated by anti-abortion, pro-adoption person. And something as small as like in 2011 or 12, somewhere around that, they changed all of their logos to be an image of a pregnant person with a heart at the, inside of them. And so just kind of like the coordination of all of this movement and how systematic it was surprising to me, and really interesting at first.
Right. So going back to what you were saying, do you think the tactics used by individuals such as Janet Porter, who pioneered the heartbeat bill, including playing ultrasounds in courtrooms, making anti-abortion songs, distributing red heart balloons and teddy bears with heartbeats, may have been what brought the success of the Senate Bill 8? Or do you see it similarly to Mike Gonadakis as just good timing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it was a combination of a lot of factors, definitely a combination of savvy marketing and good timing. we talked to a lot of experts, like I had kind of alluded to, were saying that, you know, in the anti-abortion movement, so much of the sort of like rhetoric and support was issues of emotional issues. Like at one point in our podcast, Janet Porter talks about like, or just all of the like imagery around a heart and a baby having a heart or a fetus having a heart. And so I think, yeah, a lot of it had to do with marketing and some of it was good timing. You know, this wasn't the first heartbeat bill to be introduced. Many before had been introduced across the country. And of course, you know, the enforcement mechanism was a key difference for SB 8 in terms of, you know, being able for people to be the one enforcing it was a key difference as well.
Right. And one of the points that Mark Lee Dixon ran off of was the writ of erasure fallacy. What could that concept, could you briefly explain it, and what could that concept mean for the country as a whole?
Yeah, so the writ of erasure fallacy was really interesting part of this research, and I think Reveal and some reporters at Reveal, Amy Littlefield, were kind of some of the first to unpack this idea. Basically, in its most simplistic form, the writ of erasure fallacy is that no law that's on the books is ever effectively like mute. So basically that courts don't have the power to strike down old laws that they think are unconstitutional. So for example, Texas statutes that are enacted in the 1850s that make it a crime to help procure an abortion or like furnish the means for it could still be active. And that was something that Jonathan Mitchell, one of the key architects behind the Heartbeat Bill, argued. And of course could have really widespread impacts if it was applied in different instances. And yeah, we have some articles written on the writ of erasure fallacy that I'd be happy to post in the chat or share afterwards. But it was definitely kind of one of the scary, just as the sort of like bounty hunter type mechanism, enforcement mechanism of SB 8, where, you know, if you think about it in other contexts as well as the writ of erasure fallacy, was just important to pay attention to.
So at the point when you were starting to report on this podcast, was it in your mind that the legislation in Texas indicated, or what it would indicate for the nation as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, looking at what was happening in Texas under SB 8 was kind of an early glimpse of what we at that point knew was likely to happen across the country if and when Roe was overturned. And so, you know, looking at really the impact of this legislation, as was sort of seen in the clip that you played, you know, all of the challenges and barriers of people having to travel, and that's for the people that can travel. And so, you know, starting to understand, like, how does a place respond? How do communities respond when this is the situation? What does organization look like? And what are, you know, the impacts on people in terms of like forced birth or worsening a crisis on maternal mortality? So yeah, looking at, you know, what was going on in Texas, I think for many of us, we were looking at it as sort of a first look at a post-Roe world.
Definitely. And that impacts everybody, not just those pregnant, people who, may have just people who could have a stillbirth or miscarriage. Of course, they're pregnant as well, but just it's a family issue, and that's important to note. A form of organization that came up in the podcast are crisis pregnancy centers, which are defined which you defined in a recent article as quasi-health clinics, mostly run by religiously aligned organizations whose mission is to persuade people to choose an option other than abortion. Can you tell us more about these organizations and their relevance then and now?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our research over the past year at Reveal has been on crisis pregnancy centers because they've been growing. So I guess I can start out first by talking a little bit about what they are. So crisis pregnancy centers, they're also referred to as anti-abortion centers or fake clinics. And then within the movement, the anti-abortion movement are often referred to as pregnancy help organizations. So they're clinics set up to appear much like an abortion clinic, but are actually run by anti-abortion organizations, and their main goal is to deter or delay somebody from having an abortion. In many cases, even their websites look like kind of a medical website, and they promote offering medical services, traditionally offering free pregnancy tests or ultrasounds, although it's important to note that the pregnancy tests and ultrasounds offered at most crisis pregnancy centers, CPCs for short, are not actually are like non-diagnostic ultrasounds, or really just the pregnancy tests that you could also buy at the store. But it's part of a tactic to try and get people to come into their door and then counsel or, convince people not to have an abortion. They're mostly run by religious organizations. And because they're not licensed medical facilities, and don't charge for their services, they are not bound by the same, by most health privacy laws like HIPAA. So knowing that, we were concerned as to, what happens to data collected on people they interact with, either online or in person. We had been doing research into some umbrella organizations, like crisis pregnancy center umbrella organizations, larger networks such as Heartbeat International, which in the past 5 to 10 years have developed tools for data management, where they store very sensitive information, including pregnancy test results, demographic information, ultrasound photos. And so, one of our big questions was what happens to that data? We also know that they've increased in terms of the number of CPCs across the country exponentially in the past few decades, especially in areas where abortion is restricted or there's some levels of restriction. Before Roe was overturned in Texas, for example, there was 10 CPCs for every one abortion clinic. And generally the average across the country, and this was numbers before Roe was overturned, before many clinics have stopped providing services, abortion clinics have stopped providing services, it's about 3 to 1. So we know that they're playing an outsized role in women's healthcare. Again, especially in areas where other services aren't available, and also that they, in many cases, get state or federal funding. A lot of state programs will refer people to education programs offered through CPCs, and TANF and Title IX funds have been diverted to CPCs, especially under the Trump administration. So yeah, they were important before Roe was overturned in terms of oversight and accountability as to what's happening there, but more and more as abortion is restricted, because again, they're kind of playing an outsized role in women's healthcare, and in terms of concerns about data collected there. So yeah, there's a lot. I could talk for a long time about CPCs. It was one of my main areas of focus. But yeah, and we recently published a story about data collection, data privacy, and CPCs as well, which is sort of a main concern now, post-Roe, as more states to move to criminalize or ban abortion.
Right. So that article titled "Facebook and Anti-Abortion Clinics Are Collecting Highly Sensitive Information on Would-Be Patients" recognizes that information potentially including names, location, family details, as well as sexual and medical history is collected and can be at risk. Can you talk about your process and involvement with that story, as well as the steps that others can take, individuals can take to protect their data and records?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, like I mentioned, one of our main questions when we started looking into crisis pregnancy centers is, what happens to the data collected by people they interact with online and in person. And online, many CPCs have been well documented as sort of having strategies toward being at the top of Google search results for abortion. They've also been well documented purveying misinformation and disinformation about reproductive health topics, such as the risks of abortion, sometimes falsely linking abortion to higher risk of breast cancer or mental health problems. And so once on their websites, there's misinformation. There's also data collection happening in terms of there's like web forms asking people to, make a schedule a quote unquote abortion consultation, which collects information that's really detailed, like the date of somebody's last menstrual period, or whether they would consider having an abortion if they're pregnant, all the way to, in the actual CPC facility, we know, like I had said, that there's these tools designed to kind of store information on patients. And so, we were curious what happens to that data. And one of our strategies for sort of cracking, into that question was what type of ad tracking technology they use on their websites. So myself and one of our data reporters at Reveal, we got data from the University of Georgia, which obtains the most up-to-date map on crisis pregnancy centers across the country. There's roughly 2,500 according to their research. And we analyzed all of the websites and found hundreds of them sending information to Facebook. And that's done through a piece of code on the websites. Facebook has policies against collecting sensitive health data, specifically sexual and reproductive health data. Although, through our research, we have found that not only is that information collected, information from crisis pregnancy center websites, but also linked back to individual profiles, kind of creating some heightened risk now, as abortion is banned and criminalized in some states, because we know that Facebook receives requests from law enforcement for data to help build criminal prosecutions, including back-end data having to do with advertising. And so amassing that type of sensitive data on Facebook, has risks in terms of potentially building cases against people who have had abortions or are doing, research in this case. So within, as to your question about, like how people could help protect their reproductive data and personal records, within the scope of our story, it's hard to avoid the Facebook pixel, which is the code that I mentioned. Other reporting has found that it's in, tens of thousands of some of the most popular websites. So really it's about public pressure on big tech companies like Facebook, as well as lawmakers to put pressure on tech companies like Facebook to do some sort of risk assessment or make commitment to not collecting that type of data. Outside the scope of this story, though, there's been a lot of reporting on the risks of data collected through period tracking apps, as well as location data and search engine data. And so I would say one of the main, most accessible things that somebody could do to protect their data would be to do sensitive research or anything sensitive, such as like if you're talking about activism, protesting, or now for many people, research on reproductive health information, to do that in a browser that's focused on privacy, as privacy is kind of like one of its main tenets. So examples of that would be Brave browser or Tor. But generally just to stay cognizant and advocate for lawmakers to pay attention to the risks there and the changing risks as laws change. I think that's one of the important things. Maybe this type of data on Facebook wouldn't have been as much a problem before, and in some ways it may seem just sort of like a symptom of the way the internet works. But now with changing laws, does pose risks. So,
Right. And of course, Roe was overturned last week. Can we talk about this moment and what it's like to report on it, share accurate information, as well as if you have any reflections that have come to you over this?
It's been a big week. I would say, I guess, just first, I'm a person first and journalist second. And so, as a person reporting on this issue, I'm a young woman, I'm from Texas, and many of the people that I care about are in places where abortion is now or will soon be restricted. So, that's a consideration. In terms of reporting on this moment, I think the big thing was that our newsroom was really prepared. We've been for a year plus planning to on how to meet the moment in terms of reporting and research and producing investigations and sharing accurate information, holding institutions like Facebook and state governments accountable. I think, I feel like we had done a lot of work to be prepared for the moment, and still somehow it was, I don't know if shocking is the right word, but it somehow, even though you're prepared for the moment when the moment comes, it can feel just, I don't know. I'm at a loss for words, I guess, about what that was like. But we quickly turned around another radio story that we published over the weekend. So the decision was last Friday, and we had a story come out on Saturday that was really sharply focused on what's next, both for the anti-abortion movement and for people fighting for abortion access, that we had spent months reporting and preparing for. So yeah, that we released that show this past weekend. Focused and with the intention to be forward-looking.
Right. So before we get too into that, Jocelyn had an interesting question in the chat, whether Reveal or other media companies that you know have been targeted for reporting the downsides of these restrictions.
We received some like messages on social media, but I think the big thing is that we work really hard to do fair, accurate reporting. And so, talking about our first podcast this year, the Strike at the Heart of Roe, on reproductive rights, we actually received a lot of positive feedback from all of our sources, saying that they felt like the decision was that the reporting was fair and accurate. In terms of our story on Facebook, we put a lot of work into fact checking. So when we release our shows and our stories, we know that they're bulletproof.
Grace, did the Supreme Court decision leak? How did that shift the conversation inside the newsroom or among the folks with the leak?
Yeah, that's a good question. At first, it felt like a big shift because it came a lot earlier than we were expecting. We've for a long time been expecting that Roe would be overturned or severely gutted, and the leak was really just a confirmation of that. And so we were already in the works of kind of reporting and researching around the idea of, what happens if Roe is overturned, how are people preparing, and what comes next. And the leak decision came in the middle of that reporting research process. And so in many ways, it ended up just being sort of a confirmation that this was a very real threat and likely to happen. And then we adjusted our reporting and research for the show from there.
So the radio story that was released over the weekend, the religious right mobilized to end Roe, now what? Will you speak on your involvement in the focus and just the general summary?
Sure, yeah. So the story was really focused on answering really the question of what now. So in the show, kind of talking about what led to this moment, but then quickly move into our reporting on this concept called abortion pill reversal, which is based off of our research and reporting, the anti-abortion movement's kind of next frontier. Essentially, it's this medically disproven strategy to reverse an abortion. It's advertised at a lot of crisis pregnancy centers across the country. And it's sort of some pushback to the rise in medication abortion, which is abortion done by a 2-pill regimen. More than half of all abortions in the US, according to the most recent data from the Guttmacher Institute, are by medication, and it's in some ways harder to regulate than a surgical abortion. And so in the conferences that we attended of anti-abortion organizations, interviews that we did with experts, abortion pill reversal is somewhat a response to that. So we break down abortion pill reversal, what it is, the research behind it, who was behind the research behind it. And then my part of the podcast was to go to back to the church that we actually grew up in Dallas, which I found out throughout the reporting process is known as the Row Church, and is kind of celebrated as a church which was involved in the organizing and actually like bringing Roe v. Wade through the courts. And they were involved in the late 60s, early 70s, pre-Roe, working with a network of clergy across the country known as the Clergy Consultation Service, who helped counsel and advise people on where they could get safe abortions, as that was one of their main concerns, was safe abortions. And they're quoted as saying, you know, that they felt they knew what the law was at the time, but felt driven by higher moral obligations, and that they felt it was their pastoral duty to help people. And so the members of the church were involved in that pre-Roe, and now since SB 8 have been organizing trips to help people in Texas travel to New Mexico for an abortion. And actually there were some really interesting connections. One of the doctors who provided illegal abortions pre-Roe, worked with this network, now owns a clinic in Albuquerque and one in Dallas, and is kind of providing the crucial link through the church and another organization helping people travel. So I got to go home to our home church there and report on that, and kind of this growing movement around the progressive religious community to organize around reproductive justice, as well as what sort of practical support looks like in terms of helping people travel, which is now necessary in more and more places.
Yes, and we can also play a clip of that story. In this section, Grace is speaking with the Reverend of the First Unitarian Church of Dallas, the Senior Reverend Daniel Cantor. Here he is speaking on the work the church has done to protect reproductive rights, or just a portion of the work the church has done, because it's spanned back since the 60s. So I may need to cut down this clip. It's a little long, but bear with me.
We're taking 20 patients, 20 travelers every 2 weeks.
It's not the daily trips that the clergy were operating in the early 70s, but patients are still arriving to a clinic owned by Dr. Boyd in New Mexico. A separate organization handles the trip logistics, like plane tickets and transportation to and from the airport. The group is called the New Mexico Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and Brittany DeFeo is their program manager.
We are not Planned Parenthood. We are a religious organization that helps women and people get access to abortion care in New Mexico.
The travelers are sitting in chairs along the walls of a room that's normally used as a classroom. In the center, there's a table of snacks that are left mostly untouched. Brittany hands out boarding passes and 2 other documents, one with the rules for the trip, and the other is a legal waiver.
Due to the environment in Texas, this is just like a precaution to keep everyone safe. Please, no pictures or social media, especially of other patients or of our clinic.
You're not going to hear from any of the patients. I was only able to observe this part of the trip on the condition that I not speak with any of them. On this morning in April, there's nothing on the books in Texas law that says it's illegal to help someone get an abortion in another state. But legal experts predict some states will try to pass laws that punish anyone who helps a person traveling to get an abortion. No matter how the laws change, Reverend Cantor assures the travelers they'll be supported by this church.
So you're in a church right now that for 50 years has been trying to make sure that you had this choice.
It's actually more like 60 years. In 1963, the national arm of the Unitarian Universalist Church announced its support for a woman's right to abortion. Ministers at this church even started driving people down to the Gulf of Mexico to get abortions on ships in international waters. The church also had a women's group studying abortion. They organized panels with doctors, activists, and legal experts, including one of the lawyers who represented Jane Roe. Reverend Cantor shares some of this history with the mostly silent room. The travelers are quiet. They've all been here for about an hour. It's still very early in the morning.
I want you to know that you're in a safe place here, that I'm the senior pastor of this church, and I believe strongly that you have the right to decide what happens to your body, when you are pregnant or not pregnant, with whom you want to be pregnant or with whom you don't want to be pregnant.
Every trip, a different Dallas clergy member goes with the patients to Albuquerque and back. This week, it's Reverend Ruth McKenzie. She's the last one to address the room.
When I was a young woman, I was pregnant and I had an abortion. And it was a hard decision for me, but it was the right decision. And I promised myself then that if I ever had the opportunity to help others, I would help, because people helped me.
As she's speaking, a charter bus pulls into the church parking lot. The group does a final ID check.
If you don't have an ID, your birth certificate.
It's because of the laws in Texas. It's absurd.
After the bus pulls out, I meet Reverend Cantor in his office. I ask him about the travelers he's met on these trips.
We don't know all their stories. Many of those travelers today are college students who, if they get derailed by a pregnancy, their whole life is changed. Now, some people will say, oh, well, that's just what they chose to do and that's what they should carry through. But it's not true. Not everybody can pivot like that.
All right, I'll pause it there since we're getting short on time. And so one of the final questions I have is, in thinking towards the future, especially considering your reporting in this space, what else are you expecting to come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, in reporting on this church specifically, and sort of their work in helping people travel, I think that more communities, and especially religious communities in some cases, progressive religious communities, maybe organizing around this issue. Reverend Cantor, who you heard in this podcast, talked a lot about kind of a reboot of the clergy consultation service. So building networks between communities, resources, people, institutions in states that do have access to abortion and those that don't, which, as I've mentioned a few times, will be probably somewhat of an ever-shifting landscape. In the past week, it's been sort of day to day different. So I think that that'll be a big movement, as there will be a lot of community organizing and direct action activism happening. But yeah, I think it's clear, you know, we went to several conferences from large anti-abortion organizations. One of them was from Heartbeat International, which is this network, like umbrella of crisis pregnancy centers. And the title of their conference this past year, which was, I believe it was in like February or March, was Onward. So, you know, the fight is not over, regardless of, for people who think that there should be abortion access and those that don't. And, you know, unfortunately, in the process of that, I think people can expect, you know, a lot of people will have to give birth when they don't want to, or be put through circumstances that they wouldn't have to had this legislation not been in place. So, I think that there's activism, but there's also a lot of not good things that could come out of this.
I would agree that my faith lies in the community and the efforts that can be done there, whether it's mutual aid or just intimately knowing the people around you and, stepping forward and having solidarity with one another. So there's power in that, but also, yes, it is a scary time.
Wow, you two really walked us through some really complicated stuff. I want to make sure that there are not other comments that you've seen in the chat that you want to address, because those audio clips, especially that last one, I want to make sure that we get the link to that so we can listen to that whole episode, because that does shift things. It's so easy to make these things binaries, like people who believe this. And what you're showing us in this conversation is this is far more complicated than these simple binaries. Somebody did ask, I think it was Teresa had asked about that video. Is that video still out there? The one that was Janet Ross, the heartbeat video?
Yeah, the Janet Porter, so both of the audio clips shared are from radio stories that we produced, and those are available to stream on the Reveal website as well as most major streaming platforms like Spotify or Apple Music. Okay. I can share the links to those. The music video I mentioned from Janet Porter, I think that you could probably find that if you search on YouTube. It's entertaining and also terrifying at the same time.
That's what I think. I don't think it's people are asking for it in order to share it, but just so horrified by the extent to which that whole campaign kind of took on a life of its own.
Right.
And that whole bit about the heartbeat and then the vibration of the veins, that was really smart to try to do that. And it sort of reminds me of some of the conversations we're having now, where sometimes giving people the real truth is still not accepted. There's still people who believe X, Y, and Z. What you have shown us, though, that this is really, really, really complicated, and that we are just beginning this path to trying to understand and trying to be respectful of all folks. Was there anything else in the chats, Jocelyn, or others that we want to address? Y'all covered a lot. And that we will also make sure that we share the links to the podcast and then the follow-up podcast as well. And then any other references or organizations doing grassroots stuff that people in different states, you're out there in the virtual pews, let us know. And I really want to know more about this church. I can't wait for your project to come out on that church.
Thank you. Yeah, I can be sure to share some links. The organization working with the churches, the New Mexico Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and we talk about them in the podcast as well.
Yes. Okay, excellent. That's really good. Well, we knew this was not going to be necessarily an uplifting conversation. I guess what it is a real conversation, and people want to have real conversations. And we thank you both for, first of all, taking this on and also being able to pivot when this actual decision has come out. It was wonderful. Grace, we wish you nothing but the best. Olivia, we thank you as well for bringing this to our attention. And this was real talk. Project Humanities has these conversations all the time. We did one a couple of weeks ago on what is asexuality. That again was eye-opening. We do these programs because we want to learn. We don't do these programs because we're here necessarily to educate other folks, but to educate ourselves and also to self-reflect. There are feedback forms because we always want some feedback at tinyurl.com/phrepro22. So please take a few minutes to sign off to let us know. But also, if you enjoyed any of this, please continue to follow us. Join us for our next one. I believe it's on homelessness, and stay connected to us. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have other forms of Twitter, social media. This is a conversation that will continue. And the more we know, the more informed we can be about the decisions that we make and the ways in which we interact and talk with others. So Thank you again. We'll ask our thank you people for attending. We know that you could be anywhere, but you chose to be with us for whatever reason. So thank you. Go back and tell somebody if you enjoyed the conversation tonight. Not necessarily if you enjoyed it, but you appreciated the perspective that was being rendered. And I don't mean enjoying because it's a tough topic to enjoy, but the fact that there are folks who are doing important work that we should know about and be participating in. So thank you very much. And we'll ask Grace and Olivia and any of our Project Humanities team to hang back and we'll do our final little gallery photo. So thank you all for attending. Join us in 2 weeks as we talk about the unsheltered and the relationship between those who are experiencing homelessness and police and policing. It should be equally eye-opening. Thank you again for joining us.